Okay, well, hello to everybody out there. Thanks for joining us. Uh, Welcome to the Hudson Library, virtually on Zoom. Thanks for joining us. I'm Derek, one of the reference librarians, and tonight with us we have Mr. Jonathan Alter. A couple little announcements before I introduce him. We have some programs you might find interesting. Thursday, February 4th at 7 p.m., we have Charles Kinney, who's the author of The Plague Cycle, The Unending War Between Humanity and Infectious Diseases. So that's kind of timely with COVID, so please join us for that. That's going to be an interesting program. Monday, February 8th at 7 p.m., we have a special program, the Pulitzer Prize winning biographer John Meacham, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. That's February 8th at 7 p.m. Then we have another program you might find interesting. Thursday, February 11th at 7 p.m., we have Janice Nimura, who's the author of The Doctor's Blackwell. How Two Pioneering Sisters Brought Medicine to Women and Women to Medicine. So join us for those. You can go on hudsonlibrary.org to sign up for those. So tonight, we'd like to also thank the Learned Owl for providing copies of this book here. So if you're curious and want to purchase one of those, in the chat window on the right-hand side, there'll be a link for that, so you can purchase that. And after the program, we will have times for a few questions, so you can post those on the very bottom where it says Q&A. And our program will be moderated by Gwen Mayer, who's our archivist here at the Hudson Library. So let's introduce the author. So tonight we have with us Jonathan Alter, and he'll be discussing his book, as you can see here, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. Alter is a Chicago native, received his BA in history with honors from Harvard in 1979. He's the author of many New York Times bestsellers such as The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies, The Promise, President Obama, 1 Year and the Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. He was the senior editor for 28 years at Newsweek. He's also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Monthly, the Atlantic, Vanity Fair, New Republic, and other publications. And he currently lives with his family in New Jersey. So I'll turn it over to Gwen and Jonathan tonight.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you, Jonathan, for coming and talking to us about your book. It was a fascinating read. I think to start things off, we'd like to sort of ask about the qualities of Jimmy Carter. Maybe as a person, not necessarily as a politician. And did the traits of him as a person hurt or hinder him sort of when he did become a politician?
It's a great question, Gwen. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I want to thank the Hudson Library for sponsoring this. As I was mentioning before we went live, Ohio is the cradle of presidents. I think there are more presidents from Ohio than any state except Virginia, and they might be pretty equal. So you have a really great, proud tradition of that. I also wanted to say, just in terms of the books, that if any of you want book plates that I sign, if you go to my website, jonathanalter.com, I'm happy to send you a inscribed book plate that you can put in the book if you choose to buy one. So the answer to your question is that Jimmy Carter has a series of character traits that are both perfectly suited to high quality, high integrity leadership, and also some of his other traits. And he's an enormously complicated individual, which kept me fascinated for more than 5 years. He has other traits that made it harder for him to govern as effectively as I think he hoped to. And so I basically ended up thinking of him as a far-sighted, even visionary president who was not a natural leader. He wasn't the kind of guy who you would go charging up the hill behind. And he would also often be a kind of a Velcro president. Everything stuck to him instead of a Teflon president, which is what they called his successor, Ronald Reagan. But the thing to understand is that he achieved much more than people realize. And there's this kind of lazy-minded, easy shorthand, which I subscribed to myself before I started on this project. Bad president, inspiring former president. That was the shorthand. The problem with it is it doesn't really comport with the historical record. And he actually got a tremendous amount accomplished amid the failures that we can talk about. I think his integrity, intelligence, decency, fundamental decency, compassion, these sorts of character traits allowed him to become, the global icon that he is today. At the same time, there were other traits that one associates with, sometimes, not all the time, but with engineers, which Carter was, that made it a little bit harder. So you may have noticed that engineers often get to senior positions in corporations, but they don't get to the very top because they think that the rational answer to a problem is something that everybody should see. Once they've dissected the problem, everybody else should come along. So Carter, like a lot of engineers, were like, well, this is the right answer. And people would go, but you're not really paying enough attention to the politics. So I ended up concluding, and I'm sorry for the long-winded answer to your extremely important question. I ended up concluding that Carter was kind of the inverse of Franklin Roosevelt, who I also wrote a book about. And after Roosevelt was inaugurated as president, just a few days later in 1933, at the depths of the Depression, he went over to Oliver Wendell Holmes's 92nd birthday party. And after he left, Holmes said of Franklin Roosevelt, he has a second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament. And I actually think the same thing is true of Joe Biden. Not a rocket scientist, neither was Franklin Roosevelt, barely passed the bar, but they had a temperament that was very useful to governing. And I think Carter was kind of the opposite. First-class intellect, one of the smartest men ever to be president of the United States, and yet a bit of a second-class temperament. He was often brusque, and he would, for all the public smiles, he would give you a tight-lipped, angry smile. Sometimes in private, he would bore in on you with those icy blue eyes, and he wasn't belittling. He wasn't mean. He certainly wasn't a bully like Trump, but he could be difficult, both as president and a former president. And that's a part of his character that you don't really see with the smiles and the cardigan sweater and the kind of, Mr. Rogers quality, or there's a Zen quality to him now that I found in my personal interactions with him. And I interviewed him many times for this book. But then other times the snappish quality would come through. So that's all just to point out that like most human beings, he's enormously complicated, much more complicated than, say, somebody like Donald Trump. And that's one of the reasons why he kept me interested for so long.
Could you sort of consider for us the measure of a president? We often measure them by their domestic agenda or their diplomatic skills or their commander-in-chief role. Talk to me a little bit about Jimmy Carter and where his strengths and weaknesses lie. And 50 years from now, 100 years from now, how will children remember him?
Shortly after Carter left office, he was kind of down in the dumps. He had been crushed by Ronald Reagan, and he's taken an appointment at Emory. It's before he started the Carter Center, and he ran into a Harvard professor who was spending time at Emory and of international relations. And he said, President Carter, 1,000 years from now, there will be very few American presidents who are remembered, but you will be because of your human rights policy. He set for the first time a global standard for how governments should treat their own people, which is a big deal. The policy turned out to be a little bit hypocritical. He didn't apply it, to every country amid the Cold War, but it did something very important. And even when we slip back and don't pay attention to human rights, as has happened in the last few years, we eventually get back in touch with these fundamental American values. And as he said in his farewell address, America didn't invent human rights. Human rights invented America. We're the only nation really founded on an idea. So that's a very important part of his legacy. I think a lot of people know that the Camp David Accords, which are the most durable and important peace treaty since World War II, was a virtuoso performance by Jimmy Carter. As Menachem Begin said, it should be called the Jimmy Carter Conference. And Israel and Egypt had fought 4 wars in the previous 25 years, and they haven't fought any in the 45 years, 47 years since the Yom Kippur War, and there hasn't been a shot fired in anger. So this is a big deal. There have been smaller wars in the Middle East, but no big ones, thanks to Jimmy Carter. And then I think the third one also, there are really 4. Establishing normal relations with China. So Nixon opened the door to China, but Carter and Deng Xiaoping walked through. And at the time they established diplomatic relations, China had an economy the size of a sub-Saharan African country. And now, this bilateral relationship that they established is the foundation, for better and sometimes for worse, of the global economy. So what Jimmy Carter himself says is that he'll be most remembered for establishing that relationship with China. But on the domestic side, he signed 15 major pieces of environmental legislation. And so children of the future will say, he didn't only, save 105 million acres in Alaska, doubling the size of the national park system, but it's the first time we had fuel economy standards, first time we had toxic waste cleanups, the strengthening of the EPA in ways that, have contributed hugely to cleaning up the environment. So often the things that kids, or future generations remember are on the environment. And he is arguably the greatest environmental president in American history, right up there with Theodore Roosevelt as a conservationist president. And I think students of the future will note that if he had been reelected in 1980, he planned to begin to address climate change, which he had first become aware of. I found records of his awareness of it as early as 1971. And he wouldn't have gotten us off a fossil fuel economy right away, but he wanted hybrid cars by the mid 80s. And he had approved a recommendation that we move toward precisely the same carbon emissions as stipulated by the Paris Climate Agreement, which was, in 2015, and this was in 1980. So I think that young people will conclude that, the stakes of that election were much higher than we realized at the time, and we would have, at least in a preliminary way, we would have begun to address climate change in the early 1980s.
Children often think about presidents and kids and animals. And as a person that was so close to nature, perhaps one of the most surprising stories of his entire administration happened on April 20th, 1979 with a rabbit.
Yeah.
It sort of set the tone in some ways for his relationship with the press. Can you talk about the rabbit and the press and the whole event?
Yeah. So his relationship with the press had already deteriorated significantly. His press secretary, Jody Powell, said, we not only didn't get a honeymoon, we didn't get a one-night stand with the press. And it was basically true. After he pardoned draft dodgers, and then he made a not very smart decision in canceling some water projects without consulting well with Congress. And then just the fact that the White House press corps was just off of Nixon. It was just only a couple of years after Nixon resigned. And so in the same way he was elected, he came out of nowhere, a peanut farmer, to get elected because of Watergate. He was also undone by Watergate, the post-Watergate press corps. So what happened with the rabbit is he's in a canoe in his hometown of Plains, Georgia, which a lot of the early part of the book is about, the just awful racial conditions in Southwest Georgia. It was basically growing up, not just in Jim Crow, but like white terrorism, local sheriff using cattle prods on 14-year-old girls in the 60s. And so, but this is in the 70s. He's back home in Plains where he lives now. It's where he was born. And he's in a canoe, and this big rabbit comes out of the water, and he has to kind of fend it off with a paddle. And so he's later that summer, it doesn't come out at first, and he tells Jody Powell and his secretary about this, Susan Clow, and the secretary, and the true story of this didn't come out until my book, she's having a drink with a reporter for the Associated Press, and she tells Brooks Jackson the story, and he writes about it in the Washington Post, in the AP. It runs the Washington Post all over the world, and it becomes a kind of a meme almost before there were memes. Oh, Jimmy Carter, he's such a small, shrunken president that he can't even take care of a killer rabbit, And then later that year, when the hostages were seized and he decided not to bomb Iran, if he had bombed Iran, the hostages would likely have been killed, but he probably would have been reelected by looking like a tough guy. Instead, he looks impotent. The hostages eventually, minutes after Reagan sworn in, they come home safe thanks to Jimmy Carter. But in the meantime, he's developed this reputation as being a kind of a wimp. And that killer rabbit incident, combined with him shortly after that collapsing in a road race when he was running in a cross-country race, these contributed to this image of Carter as weak. And as I indicated before when I was talking about his personality, anybody who ever worked for him or with him, like weak would be the last word they would use to describe him. He's really a very tough guy in a lot of ways. And so, but he allowed he told me early on, he said, the biggest misconception about him was that he was weak. And it's his fault in some ways for letting that perception take root. And the killer rabbit story was part of that.
Talk to me about his relationship with the Kennedys, because certainly it's full of turmoil and issues.
Yeah, so he and Ted Kennedy were like oil and water. I mean, he had, growing up, he had loved, not growing up, when he was a young adult, he had loved JFK and sort of patterned himself after him. And when he was on the cover of Time magazine shortly after he became governor, they said he looked like JFK. Even Rose Kennedy thought he looked a little bit like her son. She said that publicly. And he, when Kennedy was assassinated, the South was so anti-Kennedy by that point because of civil rights that his son had a teacher who basically cheered, and Chip threw a chair at him and was, suspended, and his parents, were totally behind him because they couldn't believe that this was going on in their town. But then later, when he meets Ted Kennedy, they really are like oil and water. They just don't get along. And this has really, in some ways, tragic consequences, because if they'd been able to connect to each other and there was plenty of blame to go around, we would have had a bill pretty similar to Obamacare in 1978, 79. And instead, what happened is all this bad blood developed, and Kennedy challenged Carter for the 1980 nomination, and Carter won the nomination, but it really weakened him in the general election against Ronald Reagan. He lost because of the hostages, because of the economy, because of a series of other things that happened. But the Kennedy challenge was an important part of that, and I have a lot of blow by blow about that hasn't been published in the past. The same way I have these love letters from Jimmy to Rosalind that have never been published. But one incident that comes to mind that some of your folks on the Zoom call might remember, at the 1980 convention, after Carter gives his acceptance speech, it takes Ted Kennedy a really long time to come over from the Waldorf Hotel in New York, and the anchors are kind of stalling and waiting for Kennedy to come, and then Kennedy finally comes, and he won't give Carter what they call the money shot of them holding their hands up, that goes on the cover of news magazines. I wasn't working at Newsweek yet. I didn't join for another couple of years, but that's what you want when you're the nominee, is the money shot unifying the party. And Kennedy wouldn't do that. And I asked Carter, what was going through your mind when Kennedy came on the podium and gave him a curt handshake? And he said that he was drunk. That's what Carter thought. We have no way of knowing whether it's true. I interviewed the Kennedy aide who was with Kennedy on the way over and at the Waldorf, and he denied that, strongly denied that. But that gives you some sense of the bad feeling. And I remember I started this book well after Ted Kennedy died, but I interviewed him in 2002, and for the Today Show, I worked part-time for NBC News, and he talked about coming close with Richard Nixon on a healthcare bill, but he wouldn't go there with Carter. He wouldn't even talk about it. I don't know if it was a sense of regret or what. In his memoirs, he's very uncharitable toward Carter, and Carter did a couple of petty things to Kennedy on judgeships, on appointing Archibald Cox of Watergate fame to the appellate court. And Carter admitted to me that was a mistake, that he didn't give Kennedy that judgeship. However, after he lost to Reagan, he did appoint Kennedy's senior staffer, Stephen Breyer, to the federal bench. And then later, Breyer was promoted to being a Supreme Court justice, as was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who Jimmy Carter plucked out of obscurity. He appointed 5 times as many women to the federal bench as all of his predecessors combined.
Wow, I didn't know that. Talk to me a little about his family and his upbringing. Everybody has their baggage with family, and yeah. I don't know anybody that could perhaps forget about Billy Beer, but at the same time, he had a mother that just everyone seemed to love. So, so he had, so I actually have some Billy Beer cans downstairs. I think
they were an enormously colorful family. And I think Billy, who died young, everybody in Jimmy Carter's immediate family, except for his mother, died of pancreatic cancer. It ran in the family. His father, his brother Billy, and his sisters Ruth and Gloria. And so in 1975, when Carter was first running for president, and he was at 0% in the polls, an obscure former governor of Georgia, Billy Carter was interviewed, and he said, I got one sister who rides with the Hells Angels. That's Gloria Carter, who was kind of like the den mother for the Hells Angels. And her tombstone reads, she rides in Harley Heaven now. She had a tattoo across her back. Amy Carter, her niece, told me that she had a tattoo across her back that was of Tweety Bird pushing a lawnmower, which I found kind of interesting. And so Billy says, I got one sister who's rides with Hell's Angels. I got another sister who's a holy roller. That's his sister Ruth, who was an evangelist, very popular kind of new age evangelist in the 1970s. She baptized Larry Flint aboard a pink yacht in the Caribbean. And then he said, and I got a mother who joined the Peace Corps at age 68. That's Lillian Carter, Ms. Lillian, Jimmy's mother, who was such an amusing character that she was a frequent guest on Johnny Carson when Carter was president. He said, I got a brother who thinks he's going to be president of the United States. I'm the only normal one in this family. And so I had a lot of fun with Billy Carter, but it turned into a tragic story because he became a very serious alcoholic, and he actually didn't like Billy beer. He would pour the contents of the beer in the toilet and fill the Billy beer can with vodka. And he got into trouble as doing work for Libya that really embarrassed his brother, although his brother didn't do anything wrong. And his brother, the president, stuck by him, but led an investigation to make sure that the public was confident that there was no undue influence in his family. It's very different from what we've seen recently. Carter definitely had a problem with Billy, but he was very above board about it, and an independent investigation found no wrongdoing on Carter's part. The rest of the family, Carter's children, a lot of people think that Amy is his only child because that's who they remember from when she was living in the White House as a 10-year-old. But he has three older sons, much older, who were about 15 years older than, the youngest is 15 years older than Amy, Jack, Chip, and Jeff. And two of them, Jack and Chip, had drug problems. So they were dealing with a lot of the problems that a lot of parents were in the 1970s. And that makes for a pretty interesting part of the story. At one point, Chip is cheating on his wife, Karen, and Karen goes and talks to the president about what to do. And at first they say that their son should leave the White House. They were living in the White House at the time. And then they finally end up leaving together. But they were very sympathetic to their daughter-in-law. Rosalind Carter is this enormously formidable figure who everybody likes. Jimmy, not so much. People have more mixed appraisals of him. They see his greatness, but also his weaknesses. With Rosalind, who was an enormously influential first lady, it's mostly very positive on mental health legislation, which she drove through Congress on being a diplomat and all the things they've done together in their post-presidency. But as I mentioned, I was most gratified to get these, what any biographer wants, like really steamy love letters between Jimmy and from Jimmy Carter, which Rosalind saved and took with her on every one of their many moves in the years after that. He didn't save her letters, unfortunately, but they're wonderful letters from the Navy that no historian had ever seen before, much less published, and way beyond, Abigail and John Adams or whatever. And so, but their partnership, and they met, this is kind of mind-blowing. So she's also from Plains, Georgia, and Lillian, Jimmy's mother, delivered Rosalind, who is about a little less than 3 years younger. And so and Rosalind is now 93 years old. And so on a couple days after Lillian delivered Rosalind Smith, she brought her 2.5-year-old over to see the new baby. So they met 93 years ago, and they've been married for 73 years. So it's a rather astonishing partnership, which, like all partnerships, had its bumpy moments, but they are connected in ways that I think that the rest of us can only view with awe.
So speaking of post-presidency, clearly Jimmy has become very well known for his service in post-presidency.
Yeah.
And clearly that was ingrained from him from an early age, this service to others, and I think to Rosalind as well. Would you say that he had a need to fix things, or do you think that it's just he had a need to serve and saw these areas that could use him? How do you explain this tremendous legacy of service after the presidency? Most presidents retire to an easy chair and occasionally a couple speaking engagements. And Jimmy continues to just constantly be out there monitoring elections, writing, being involved in his foundation.
Yeah, well, the Carter Center has made an enormous contribution, and they've basically eradicated guinea worm disease and made great progress on other diseases. Particularly in 1994, he prevented wars in Haiti and North Korea. He and many other things, and people associate him with Habitat for Humanity. He doesn't actually run that, but every year he goes on what they call a build, and he builds a house. And I built a house with them. I should put "built" in quotes. It's my contribution. President Carter tried to teach me how to hammer better on the house we were building together in Memphis, with partial success. He and Rosalind are amazing on a work site. And so the contributions just go on and on. In answer to your question, I think it's a combination of his faith. He's one of the most religious presidents, maybe the most religious president in American history. He's a Baptist, but Rosalind was raised as a Methodist. And I think in some ways, his faith is a little more Methodist. Do as much as you can, for as many as you can, for as long as you can. That's John Wesley's credo. Some religious scholars told me they think that Jimmy Carter and John Wesley actually have a lot in common personally. So that's on the religious side. And there was a point when he actually went on religious missions in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, and Springfield, Massachusetts. He went door to door for Jesus in 1968 and had many adventures. They once came upon a brothel, and they tried to talk the madam out of sin and were not successful in that, but they did find some other converts. So the religious impulse clearly has driven this quality that you described. I think his mother's example, she was a nurse. She took care of Black patients for free. His father was a white supremacist. His mother was a very compassionate individual, and a lot of the diseases she was treating in rural Georgia in the 1930s, Carter saw again in Africa in the 1980s. And so I think that impulse was part of it. And, she joined the Peace Corps, as I mentioned. And then the third thing is, I think, a sense of guilt and atonement. So a part of the book that we haven't talked about yet is that Jimmy Carter ducked the civil rights movement. He was not ever racist. In fact, he was early in, when he got to the Naval Academy, for instance, he was defending the first ever black midshipman. Here's a Southern guy, the other Southerners couldn't believe it. So it wasn't his personal views. He did that again later on in the Navy. But then he's in Admiral Rickover's nuclear navy, which is the most exciting technological project of the middle part of the 20th century. He's right there. And his father dies, and he goes home to assume his father's duties with their business, their warehouse and their farms, especially the warehouse. And if he wants to succeed in business, there's only so much that he can do to defy the rigid Jim Crow of that era. And then he becomes chairman of the school board in Sumter County. And I'm looking at the minutes of the school board from like 1959, 1960. He doesn't do anything to implement Brown versus Board of Education. And at first I'm thinking, well, what's the problem here? Why get with the program, Jimmy? And it's because the Georgia state legislature had actually passed a bill saying, if you do anything to integrate, the schools automatically close. So he couldn't really do that. Then when he goes into politics, at first, blacks couldn't vote. And so he's representing, this extremely conservative rural white constituency, and he kind of ducks. And then it gets even worse. In 1970, he runs a sort of a dog whistle campaign to get elected governor of Georgia, where he needs that rural racist segregationist vote. And he meets with the head of the White Citizens Council, and he sends signals to them that he's one of them. Then his first day in office, he says in his inaugural address, time for racial discrimination is over. And everybody's shocked, like the whites thought he was betraying them. The black Georgians are going, he said what? They couldn't believe it. And by this time, he's becoming friendly with Daddy King and Coretta King. Never met Martin Luther King. I did. He was in my home when I was 10 years old, but Jimmy Carter never met him, even though they were from the same state. And so he's making up through his governorship, his presidency, his post-presidency. He's making up for what, in the second half of his life, for what he didn't do in the first half of his life. And I think there's a real message for all of us in this sort of time of racial reckoning that we're living in right now, which is, okay, maybe I was a little late to the cause of racial justice and being sensitive to police brutality, but now, what can I do? Better late than never. And so I think there's a lot of that in Carter, which I explored with him. He wasn't kind of psychologically ready to fully cop to that, but he did indicate that what he called his, quote, late awareness of racial injustice helped to power the achievements of the second half of his life.
Jonathan, we just came through a very contentious election.
Yeah.
And Ohio was not the center of the election for once.
No, it wasn't.
It was this little state called Georgia.
Yeah.
Where the only past president from Georgia was Jimmy Carter.
Mm-hmm.
I did not really hear his name mentioned a great deal in all the bantering about the election and the very close senatorial elections and the presidential election. Mm-hmm. What do you have to say about that?
Well, so Jimmy Carter, he was 90 when I started this book, and through for 5 years he was in astonishing shape, and he had knee replacement, he walked well, he thought his mind was so sharp, and I think his mind is still sharp. But he had a fall in 2019, and he had a subdural hematoma. You might remember the picture of him on a work site where his face is all bruised. At that time, he didn't know that he had this. Went to the hospital, had to go through a lot of rehab, learning how to speak. He doesn't see well. So, like, I used to have an email relationship with him, like a number of people. Now nobody does because he can't read email. He's been listening to my book on Audible because he can't really read anymore. So he just can't be as involved in these campaigns. And that's why he couldn't go to the inauguration. He's just too frail. Strong supporter of Joe Biden and spoke for him in a taped audio message at the Democratic convention. And his grandson, Jason Carter, who is head of the Carter Center now, ran for governor in 2014. He's a very talented Democrat, and he's very close. Stacey Abrams, who came down and campaigned when she was running for governor with Jimmy Carter. So he's very tight with the Democrats there. And it's just that they are, too old to be actively involved. But he is a revered figure, particularly in the Black community in Georgia. And, increasingly, it used to be so much more polarized and increasingly in the white suburbs that went for Biden and for Ossoff and Warnock, there is growing appreciation of Carter. I think, for much of his life, he was admired but not beloved. I think he's now, including with younger people, he's now moving into that category of being beloved. And Pete Buttigieg, Cory Booker, and Amy Klobuchar all made pilgrimages to Plains in 2020, and he didn't endorse any one of them, but he really liked the generational change, and he continues to issue important statements about what's going on in the world. And the Carter Center is going to be involved in COVID relief in the developing world. There's now a real gap between rich and poor countries that they will be part of addressing.
Is this the first book that you've written that you had a real-time relationship with the subject?
No. So I wrote 2 books about Barack Obama, who I've known since he was an Illinois state senator. And so I had a not obviously Obama was president at the time. So my access to him in the period that I was working on the book was much more limited than my access to Carter afterward. I also had a fair amount of access to Biden when I was working on those books. And I talked to Obama about Carter after my deadline for the hardcover. So it's in the audio, just a paragraph in the audio book and the paperback when it comes out later this year. The difference, really, Gwen, is that this is the first biography that I've written. So in the case of Roosevelt and Obama, I was writing about a 2-year period in their lives, basically. Obama's first year, Roosevelt's first 100 days, and his election and much of his first year, and then with the second Obama book, a lot of it was about 2011 and 2012, and Obama, the way he was governing and dealing with his enemies. So a biography is much more daunting, and it's much more about trying to get to a deeper level of who is this person and what makes him tick, and the layers of Jimmy Carter are so. I guess to use a biblical metaphor, he's a man in full of many. I'm spacing on the expression, but many mansions, It contains multitudes, let's put it that way. And so this, I hope, that this comes through, and that because he's led an epic, almost novelistic American life. And really, no running water, no electricity, barefoot most of the year when he's a young boy. It might as well have been in the 19th century. The guy basically lived in 3 centuries. And then the 20th century connected to all the powerful movements of the 20th century. We talked about the women judges. He moved the U.S. government and the government of Georgia from tokenism to true diversity. He was the first president of diversity. So really connected civil rights, women's movement, all these movements of the 20th century, the Cold War. And then now, what does the Carter Center do? It does conflict resolution, global health, democracy promotion. These are the big cutting edge issues of the 21st century. So this is a man who's lived in all of these centuries, and getting my arms around that, not to mention, the literally millions of documents at the Carter Library and in other libraries. Obviously, I couldn't, take Robert Caro's advice and turn every page. And then I interviewed more than 250 people for this, and I listed all of them in the book. Now,
Jonathan, clearly he's a man worthy of all of our respect and admiration, but no man is perfect.
Yeah.
What would Rosalind say his biggest weakness is, or what's her greatest complaint? Did he leave his tennis shoes muddy as he came in the house? Everybody has a flaw.
Well, I'll tell you first to the question. At one point I said, Mrs. Carter, is your husband stubborn? And she just laughed. She said, "You think?" So he's a very stubborn individual, and he, can be snappish, including toward his own wife. There were 2 interesting low points in their marriage. She didn't want to go back to Plains after Jimmy's father died in 1953, and she gave him the silent treatment all the way back, because he had made the decision without her, which he now realizes was wrong and was, not the way you should deal with your wife. And he had this kind of, Admiral Rickover was a real SOB, and, his children complained. He hit them with a paddle. Jimmy Carter paddled his kids. And, his son Chip told me that they used a paddle that his mother, Lillian, got from when she was the frat mother at Auburn University. And he could see the letters of the fraternity in reverse on black and blue on his rear. And so early in and then later he didn't do that, but he was on a learning curve and learning how to be sensitive and not be such a disciplinarian. And then after the presidency, they made from their lights, bad decision to write a book together. It's called Everything to Gain, and making the most of the rest of your life. It's about like living in retirement. And they fought really hard to the point where they were communicating through notes and not speaking to each other because Jimmy thought that Rosalind wrote too slow, and Rosalind thought that Jimmy's writing wasn't good, and they remembered the same events differently. And finally, an editor, Peter Osnos, came down to Plains, and he said, "All right, we'll just put a little JC and an RC, and you can each write your own sections of the book." So he is far from perfect, and we haven't talked about, what happened, Iranian Revolution, and a lot of these events are misunderstood, but he got swamped at the end of his presidency. And the biggest thing that they argued about, and where Rosalind was really right, is that Carter didn't do enough to connect politics to policy. You can't just say, oh, this is the right policy answer. Now go do it. You have to think of a strategy for getting it done. And he lost his connection to the American people. And so the book is very much warts and all. But what it does avoid is the easy stereotypes, the story that we think we know about this man, which doesn't really bear scrutiny. And I think a lot of people have come to recognize this. I talked to a number of conservatives who had thought, very little of Carter's foreign policy, and they belittled human rights. You can't do that in the middle of the Cold War. And now this was so important, and Václav Havel says it was so important, and all these Latin American countries moved from dictatorship to democracy in part as in the wake of the human rights efforts. And I interviewed George H.W. Bush not too long before he died, and he was very complimentary of what Carter did for him in Nicaragua, where he talked Daniel Ortega into respecting the election returns. This was the first time a communist ever left office peacefully. And Carter talked him into it. He said, look, losing is hard, but it's not fair to the Nicaraguan people to be a sore loser. Sounds a little familiar. And Ortega left. And then he said to him, Daniel, you might be able to come back. And Ortega did come back through an election, but he respected the election returns. He thought that was stolen too. But Carter said, you know what? I'm down here monitoring it. It wasn't stolen. You lost. It's time to go. And so Bush really appreciated that. But on the other hand, and this gets to the question of warts, his relationship with Bush and Jim Baker ended because in the run-up to the Gulf War in 1991, Carter wrote heads of state to vote against the United States in the UN. And, Bush was like apoplectic about this. You can't do that. We only have one president at a time. What are you doing to me? So this goes to and Carter defends it. But nobody else does. Democrats, Republicans, they all think Carter was wrong in doing that. So this is a flawed, but also very inspiring individual.
Well, thank you for taking the time to examine his life and the years worth of research that you've done to create this, plus the relationship that you developed with him that enabled you to interview him. I do have questions from the audience.
Oh, great. Good.
The very first one is, who's the next person you're going to write about?
If you have any suggestions, I signed a 2-book contract with Simon & Schuster, and they're kind of breathing down my neck now. What's your next book going to be? I don't think it's going to be a biography just because it's so consuming. You have to live with the person. And I liked living with Jimmy Carter, especially in the last 4 years. It was a vacation for me from the incumbent. And so I really liked that. I liked that Carter was kind of the un-Trump. I can't think of somebody right now who hasn't been written about. I mean, Carter, there have been no, independent biographies of him before. A staffer wrote one. Another staffer wrote a book about his presidency fairly recently. But I had this huge hole in the line of scrimmage. And if you can suggest to me, somebody else who would be really great to do a biography of that nobody else has tackled, I would consider that. Or maybe, another story, a more discrete episode in American history or in the life of an American president that I'm very open to thinking about. So there's still time. Whoever asked that question.
Tell us your website again so people can send you suggestions.
Yes, you can send me, and you can email them to me too. Always happy to hear from people.
Okay, someone wants to know about reports online that Carter and Motown founder Berry Gordy are second cousins through Miss Lillian's father. Do you know anything about this?
Yes, I have that in my book. So Berry Gordy Jr. and Jimmy Carter, who to my knowledge never met, share the same great grandfather. So Jimmy Carter didn't know his great-grandfather, but Jimmy Carter's mother, Lillian, her maiden name is Gordy, Lillian Gordy Carter. And her grandfather in the, before abolition, before the Civil War, had a relationship and fathered a child with a slave, very common in the South. And that was the father of Berry Gordy Sr. And then they actually did rather well, especially for African Americans in Washington County, Georgia. But around 100 years ago, the Gordy family moved to Detroit, I think before Jimmy was born. And because those things were very hush-hush, he had no knowledge of it growing up. And then, now he knows about this, but, a lot of people are related to a lot of people. But yes, it is true.
Someone else asked about Carter being elected to the presidency. Could that have happened any other time, or was it really Watergate that got him elected?
I think it's the latter. I think if it hadn't been for Watergate, I don't think Carter would have had a chance. In those days, it was, very unusual for the Democratic Party to nominate a complete outsider, a nobody, who didn't really have any connections to Washington. And so if people hadn't wanted, he ran as a candidate of healing. It's a little bit like Biden's campaign this last time. And he said, "I'll never lie to you." And amazingly, he exaggerated, but I looked pretty hard, and he didn't tell whoppers. There was, so I don't think it could have happened without people wanting relief from Watergate. And then, he got all this ethics legislation through. So Trump would never have been impeached the first time if it wasn't for the Ethics in Government Act of 1978, which set up the first whistleblower protections, the first inspector generals, FISA courts. All of that was done under Carter, and I think he could have. I guess I'm cautious about saying never say never. Yes, could there have been other circumstances? Maybe like this past year where Jimmy Carter could have made it. Yes, but Watergate certainly helped.
One last question, and then we'll wrap things up. Tell us about his creative side, his poetry, his wonderful letters to Rosalind. Does he paint? I mean, this whole expression, the creative impulse, did he have that while he was in the White House?
He didn't really have time in the White House to cultivate that, but it's very important to him. And he's kind of he's an engineer with a humanist struggling to get out, an artist struggling to get out. And he's very disciplined in the way he approaches everything. So when he wanted to become a painter, and he has a book of paintings, and they're not bad. I mean, he's not going to be in the Louvre, but they're not bad. He brought artists in to learn, what brushes do you use? He treated it almost like an engineering project, the same way he engineered peace in the Middle East. When he wanted to learn how to write poetry, he was writing, pretty bad rhyming poetry, and he befriended these first-class poets, and they taught him to be a competent poet. And he has a book of poetry called Always a Reckoning, and a few of the poems are really quite good, and I used them in selections of them in my book, because at one point he told me, I really don't know how to express my feelings outside of poetry. He has a hard time, like many men of his generation, really emoting. And then he has so many other skills. He really is the first president since Jefferson who you could say is a Renaissance man. He has mad skills in a lot of different areas, and arguably his best is woodworking. And anybody who has any interest in woodworking, I would recommend his book on that. He's written more than 30 books. And I saw all the furniture in his house, and and some of what's in the Carter Center he built, and it is beautiful. He's a better woodworker than some of the other things that he's tried to do. He wrote a novel. The novel actually is not very good. It's about the Revolutionary War. His best book is called An Hour Before Daylight, and it's about his boyhood. And it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So it's quite a good little short book.
Jonathan, thank you. I think you've done a wonder in exposing us a little more to Jimmy Carter, and hopefully people will pick up the book and read it. I do think it was well worth the read. And I had read books by Jimmy Carter, and I even learned a great deal from your book. So thank you for writing it and spending the time with us to talk about it. We wish you well in your future endeavor, and hopefully some of us will give you some ideas. And, if you're ever in Northeast Ohio, please come by Hudson when there's not a pandemic.
Oh, that's very nice of you to invite me. And my son is one of LeBron James's producers of his HBO show, The Shop. And so we have that connection to Ohio, and I'm really grateful to you for hosting this event. And as I mentioned, anybody, if you go on my website at jonathanalter.com, you can order a book plate if you want that.
One last question. A patron asked that we pan your camera up just a little to see the poster that's behind your head.
Oh, okay. So that's a good point. I should have that a little bit more in view. So that is the recruiting poster that my late father responded to in Chicago after Pearl Harbor. And and then behind me, you can see my book with the Andy Warhol cover that I have. I wanted to show that Carter was, at a certain point, he was cool, like Andy Warhol cool, and Hunter Thompson loved him, which is a story I didn't get to tell. And then I've got a bust of Franklin Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt at the wheel of the ship of state. And the recruiting poster, my father signed up. He entered the Army Air Corps. He flew 31 missions over Nazi Germany in a B-24, was shot down, and fortunately survived, or I wouldn't be here.
We're so glad he did survive and that you did share your evening with us tonight. Thank you so much, and I encourage you all to go out and read or buy the book. It's well worth it. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Gwen.